They thought firing me would be the end of the story. What they didn't know was that I had already written the final chapter months ago. My name is Maren Holloway, and for 18 years, I was the quiet force behind Carrian Technologies' most critical systems. I built the infrastructure they all depended on. But when the new CEO arrived, he decided I didn't belong in the picture anymore. So, on a Monday morning, in front of the entire executive team, he made his move. Monday morning started like any other, until it didn't. At 9:40 a.m., I stepped into the executive conference room carrying my notes and an annotated system audit that had taken me all weekend to prepare. I wasn't expecting applause, but I certainly wasn't expecting an ambush either. Philip Crane, the newly appointed CEO, sat at the head of the table like a king holding court. His tie was sharp, his smile even sharper. The rest of the leadership team was already seated, including Savannah, my former mentee, someone I once stayed up late training back when she didn't even know how to launch a basic test environment. "Maren," Philip said, folding his hands like he was hosting a game show. "Let's keep this short." I froze mid-step, my notebook still clutched in one hand. He didn't let the silence breathe. "As of this moment, your role at Carrian Technologies is being dissolved. Effective immediately." Nobody gasped. No one screamed. Instead, the air thinned into something suffocating, tight, silent, and paralyzing. Eyes dropped to desks, pens tapped nervously. No one moved to object, not even Savannah. I scanned the room, searching for someone, anyone, with the decency to look me in the eye. No one did. Philip slid a sealed envelope across the glass table toward me like it was the check at a dinner party. "You'll find your severance outlined in here. HR will assist you with your exit logistics by noon." I didn't sit. I didn't touch the envelope. My pulse was steady. Almost too steady. Because this wasn't a surprise. This exact date, this exact time, 9:40 a.m. on a Monday, had been programmed into Sentinel's contingency trigger months ago. When I first noticed the leadership changes coming, I made sure that if my credentials were ever revoked under hostile conditions, Sentinel would begin a silent lockdown, freezing Carrian's back-end system layer by layer. They didn't know that. They thought they were just terminating a job title. I calmly stepped forward, placed my company badge right in the center of the table, and looked Philip directly in the eye. That smug little curl on his lip didn't even flicker. "Understood," I said simply. Then I turned, walked past Savannah's downcast face, past the people who had once cheered my system launches, and walked out of the room without making a sound. Only when the door clicked shut behind me did the smile start to form. It wasn't the kind of smile born of happiness, but the kind born of absolute certainty. The countdown had just begun. As I stepped into the elevator that Monday morning, just minutes after my very public dismissal, I didn't break down. I didn't rush for the parking lot or immediately call a lawyer. I simply tapped the button for the ground floor, held my breath for a count of 3, and exhaled. Because this wasn't panic. This was protocol. The ride down gave me time to think, though I really didn't need much. The plan had already been put in motion the exact second Philip Crane signed my termination order. What no one in that building realized was that I wasn't just another employee. Years ago, long before Carrian Technologies became a rising name in enterprise logistics, it was a dying startup teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. The infrastructure was an absolute mess. Systems were overlapping, data was leaking, and vendors were pulling out left and right. I was brought in on a contract basis to stabilize the chaos. But what I did was far more than that. I designed and deployed an internal relay system, one that could sit quietly between every key transaction, redirecting, validating, and securing data across departments without drawing any attention. I called it Sentinel. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't come with a fancy pitch deck or a flashy product launch. It was just a smart, silent layer that did what everyone else forgot to do. It held the whole damn thing together. Over time, the company recovered. New deals came in, heavy-hitting investors started calling, the infrastructure became bulletproof. What no one realized was that Sentinel didn't actually live on Carrian's servers. When I first built it, I saw way too much internal instability, political infighting, short-term leadership playing musical chairs. So I didn't embed Sentinel directly into Carrian's core system. Instead, I spun up a secure external server cluster registered under my own LLC, buried deep beneath routine hosting metadata. Sentinel was deployed through that channel, like a clean bypass cable that only I knew existed. Legally, I retained ownership. Technically, I maintained full control. They used it every single day. They just never understood that it was never theirs. No one questioned it, because I made sure Sentinel did one thing better than anything else. It never failed. As long as it worked, they didn't care how. After I was promoted to lead systems architect, I deliberately kept Sentinel out of the official documentation. It became the invisible spine of our operations. Even Savannah, who once shadowed me for 6 straight months, never thought to ask about the ghost protocol alerts that only I received to my personal device. And when Philip Crane joined as CEO, I knew. I saw the signs, the aggressive language of cost-cutting, the desperate hunger for control. That's exactly when I coded in the contingency trigger, a silent dead man's switch. If my credentials were ever terminated without Sentinel's reauthorization, the system would begin a gradual shutdown, not all at once, not violently, just enough to slowly break everything. So, no, I wasn't afraid when Philip smiled at me across the conference table. He thought he was just erasing an old name from the org chart. He didn't know he was surgically disconnecting Carrian from its own spine. As the elevator dinged and the doors slid open, I walked calmly through the lobby, right past the receptionist who didn't even bother to look up. I stepped out into the crisp, cold sunlight and pulled out my phone. Not to call anyone, but just to check the Sentinel activity log. It had begun. 2 days after my dismissal, I received a formal transition notice from HR. It didn't explicitly say I was being fired. Not exactly. It was dressed up in sanitized, cowardly corporate language. Effective immediately, your position is being redefined as a temporary technical advisor under the CTO's oversight. No office, no team, no direct reports, just a shared desk in a forgotten, drafty corner of the second floor with no nameplate and no wired Ethernet connection. My badge still worked, but only on select floors, and the email system had stripped my title down to Consultant Infrastructure, Temporary. It was painfully clear I wasn't being transitioned. I was being erased. Meanwhile, Philip was busy painting a brand new version of Carrian. One filled with corporate buzzwords, soft launch posters, and a team that looked like it was cast straight out of a Silicon Valley startup fashion catalog. I met them later that week during a company-wide town hall. Philip proudly introduced his new tech visionaries, a hand-picked squad of bright-eyed, fresh-faced talent pulled mostly from his old firm in Manhattan. They all dressed in expensive neutral tones and said things like cross-functional innovation and next-gen workflows with a deeply uncomfortable level of unearned confidence. To the board, they looked fresh, disruptive, and clean. To me, they looked like a terrible investment just waiting to implode. One of them, a guy named Trey, couldn't have been more than 28. He had a slick haircut, blindingly perfect teeth, and an Apple Watch that he kept tapping like it gave his life purpose. On the 3rd day, I found him standing in the server staging room, holding an iPad and looking visibly confused. "Hey, you're Marin, right?" he asked. I nodded. Cool. Quick question. This directory tree here?" He turned the tablet toward me. "Is it safe to archive this whole cluster? It's not labeled and it hasn't been touched in like 8 months. My stomach turned. It was Sentinel's decoy structure, an intentionally inert layer specifically meant to misdirect anyone poking around too deeply. Deleting it wouldn't break the system, but it would absolutely trigger Sentinel's auto-preservation protocols. "You shouldn't touch that," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm. "It's tied to some critical legacy workflows." Trey smiled in that dismissive, arrogant way only the young and unproven know how to wear. No worries. Already queued it for deletion anyway. Gotta clean out the cobwebs, right? I didn't argue. I just turned and walked away. What he didn't know, and what no one in Philip's little army of Instagram-ready engineers knew, was that Sentinel had been trained for moments exactly like this. When it detected a deletion request without matching credentials or origin authorization, it automatically cloned the affected structure to a shadow drive, masked the original behind a decoy layer, and rewrote the access log to read as action completed to Trey and his internal dashboard. His command succeeded on his screen. But in reality, Sentinel had just saved the company from a catastrophic breach of its own operational backbone, and nobody even knew. Not Philip, not Trey, and not Savannah. Especially not Savannah. She had gone from my eager mentee to a corporate middle manager in less than a year, now proudly overseeing strategic systems transition. She no longer made eye contact with me in the hallway when she passed by. Her smile was thin, polite, but entirely performative. I had trained her from the ground up, fed her confidence when she doubted herself, taught her how to navigate misaligned documentation and messy legacy code. And now she stood shoulder to shoulder with the very people replacing me, as if I had never existed at all. They weren't just replacing talent with trendiness, they were replacing actual history with style. Still, I didn't protest. I didn't complain. Let them talk about digital transformation and product-market synergy all they wanted. Let them try to gut the system from the outside in. Because for now, Sentinel still held the line, and I still held Sentinel. The illusion of control was theirs, but the architecture? That was still mine. That thought lingered with me as I walked into the main demo hall on Thursday morning. The whole floor had been completely rearranged. Rows of folding chairs were set up neatly in front of the massive main screen. Branded slides slowly rotated on a projector, labeled Innovation Sprint, Rethinking the Backbone. I instantly recognized the phrase. It had been copy-pasted directly from one of my old infrastructure overviews, except now it was being used to dismantle the very thing it once beautifully described. Philip's team had invited everyone from engineering, ops, and even marketing to the big event. I hadn't been formally asked to attend, but my calendar pinged with a blanket all-staff welcome invite, and someone from HR mumbled something to me in passing about technical presence optics. So I took a seat near the back, far off in the right corner. Quiet, removed, unnoticed. No nameplate, no introduction, no welcome back. Savannah took the stage alongside Trey. Both of them dressed like they had just stepped off a TED Talk set. Savannah wore a sleek silk blouse and the kind of warm smile I used to trust completely. Trey had a presentation remote in one hand and sheer, unearned confidence in the other. Today, we're going to show you exactly where Carrian Technologies is headed, Savannah began, projecting her voice perfectly. A system that's lighter, faster, and built for massive scale. We're officially leaving behind outdated legacy protocols and ushering in a brand new digital era. I watched silently as they confidently walked the room through a UI shell I recognized all too well. It was literally just a fresh coat of paint. Nothing more. The routing logic beneath it? Still Sentinel. The complex security sequences? Still Sentinel. They didn't even realize the data flowing in their live demo was being silently filtered and validated by the exact same system they were pretending didn't exist anymore. Then, it happened. Trey pulled up a back-end config panel on the screen and completely misused a key technical term. He pointed to a subnet scheduler and confidently called it a floating token distributor, which made absolutely zero technical sense. I couldn't help it. I raised a hand, just slightly. Not to embarrass him, not to interrupt the flow, just to clarify a critical error in front of the engineering team. I didn't even get a chance to speak. Savannah saw me. She paused mid-sentence, then forced a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Marin," she said into the mic, her voice perfectly modulated for corporate civility. "We really appreciate you being here today, but since you're no longer part of the active development team, let's give the floor to the current architects." A few heads turned in my direction. Most didn't. The silence that followed wasn't loud. It was deeply empty, like a room full of people all collectively pretending not to notice a small, incredibly cruel thing happening in real time. I nodded once. No anger, no snappy comeback. I just stood up, walked to the back, and let the heavy door click shut behind me as I stepped out into the hallway. The walls out there were quiet. The thick carpet muted my footsteps. I didn't look back. I made my way to the coffee machine by the corner lounge. It sputtered quietly as it slowly filled a cheap paper cup with black coffee. I sat on the worn gray bench nearby, just holding the cup, letting it burn my hands a little, completely untouched. That was when I noticed the intern. Jamie, one of the brand new hires from the admin pool, was lingering by the hallway. He had his phone in his hand, his expression frozen in awkward, wide-eyed realization. He had been recording the demo for his notes, as interns often do. What he hadn't expected was to capture that exact moment on video. Me being publicly asked to leave, and the room's cold reaction, or lack thereof. We made eye contact. His face flushed bright red. He quickly lowered the phone, spun on his heels, and practically speed-walked away. By that afternoon, the video clip had made its way through a dozen private Slack channels. I overheard it being referenced near the elevators. "Did you see what happened to Marin?" someone whispered loudly to a coworker. "They just completely shut her down mid-meeting." But no one actually said anything to me directly. No quick apology, no sympathetic message, no, "Hey, are you okay?" Just standard corporate silence. Clean, chilled, completely impenetrable. I finished my coffee slowly, my eyes fixed firmly on the floor tiles. My badge still technically worked. My system access, though heavily limited, still allowed me to view Sentinel's core logs remotely. I tapped into the admin monitor from my phone right there in the lounge. 1 unauthorized protocol rename attempt, 2 failed credential pings, 1 auto-restore complete. Sentinel was fully operational. I closed the tab and sat still for another long moment, letting the sting of humiliation settle into my bones. Not as defeat, but as raw data. They had cut me out of the shiny presentation, but they were still standing on the very system I built with my bare hands, and they didn't even have a clue. No one had looked me in the eye as I walked out of that demo. No one followed me to check in, not even Savannah. That profound silence stayed with me as I drove home in the dark that night, my headlights catching familiar street signs I'd passed for years. The bright office lights had dimmed miles behind me, but the humiliation hadn't faded. It sat right there in the passenger seat like a ghost I couldn't shake off. When I finally entered my apartment, I didn't even bother turning on the main lights. I dropped my bag heavily by the front door, kicked off my shoes, and headed straight for my desk. The room was perfectly still. Only the low, steady hum of the air purifier in the corner reminded me I wasn't completely underwater. I opened my laptop, the familiar blue glow spilling onto my face. My fingers moved purely on instinct. New email. Subject, formal resignation, effective immediately. I stared at the blank white body of the message for a long while before I finally began typing. To whom it may concern, I am formally submitting my resignation from Carrian Technologies, effective immediately. I am grateful for the opportunities provided over the years and wish the current team continued success. It sounded incredibly sterile, completely professional, exactly the kind of sanitized exit they expected from me. But halfway through rereading the paragraph, I stopped. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then I hit backspace and deleted the entire thing. I didn't know if I actually wanted to quit, or if I just wanted it all to stop hurting. On pure impulse, I opened the Sentinel admin console. The dark terminal loaded slowly, the green command bar blinking with the warmth of an old friend. I'd built this specific console to be strictly private, highly responsive, and totally irreversible. 1 line of code. That's all it would take to wipe Sentinel completely from their infrastructure. I could erase it all. Every strand of code, every single log entry, every silent background process currently running beneath their glossy new dashboards. No more safety net, no more invisible shield protecting their assets. But my hands refused to move across the keys. If I did it, innocent people would suffer. Not just Philip or Savannah, but the clients, the lower-level tech support guys, the vendor partners, the hardworking people who actually relied on this infrastructure to protect what they'd built. People exactly like I used to be. I leaned back, stared up at the dark ceiling, and clearly heard my late father's voice echoing in my head. If they refuse to see you, make sure they feel you in the results. And yet, I had to wonder, how much longer was I willing to remain unseen? I returned my focus to the terminal. My cursor was still blinking over the same half-typed execution command. I cleared the line, closed the execution window, and opened the system logs instead. That's exactly when I saw it. Alert, unauthorized access attempt, 8:14 p.m. Origin, unregistered device, internal network, Carrian HQ. I clicked into the detailed log. Someone had attempted a massive root restructure request directly on Sentinel. That was no routine maintenance call or accidental ping. That was a blatant, targeted power grab. Sentinel had blocked it immediately, exactly as I had programmed it to do, but the request had been sloppily disguised behind a spoofed IP address. Lazy, but highly ambitious. I traced the headers manually. It took me less than 30 seconds. Sentinel always kept immaculately clean records, no matter how hard someone tried to hide their tracks in the mud. The source IP resolved to smercer@carriantech.com. Savannah. My jaw clenched tight, but I didn't move. I didn't curse out loud. I didn't even blink. I just stared intensely at her name on the screen. She hadn't just stepped into my old seat to play boss. She was actively trying to rewrite the system's core under her own name to take the credit. 3 years ago, I had gone to bat for her with the board after she accidentally redirected a major client's financials to a completely unsecured public server. I took the blame. I cleaned up her massive mess, and now she was trying to steal everything I'd built, silently, strategically, sweeping me away like I'd never existed. I didn't send the resignation letter. I didn't send a warning email either. Instead, I opened a secondary terminal window and typed in a brand new command. Activate watch mode trace. Target, unauthorized access log. Shadow channel, Sentinel. The terminal blinked back a single glorious confirmation line. Monitoring initiated. I closed my laptop and let the heavy silence return to the apartment. Only this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt loaded, like a drawn bowstring. The morning after I activated watch mode, an email from HR landed in my inbox at 8:15 a.m. sharp. No polite greeting, no human contact, just a cold, automated directive. Please schedule a time this week to retrieve your personal belongings from the premises. A security escort will be provided as per standard offboarding protocol. It hit me harder than I expected, not because I didn't see it coming from a mile away, but because it was just so remarkably impersonal. 18 years of blood, sweat, and code, and I was reduced to a checked box on a corporate offboarding checklist. Still, I replied with a single polite sentence and chose the earliest available time slot. I needed to close the loop physically. Not for them, but for me. When I arrived at Carrian HQ later that afternoon, the lobby lights felt significantly brighter than usual, like the building itself was overcompensating for something. The receptionist didn't even glance up from her monitor. I gave my name. Moments later, a young guy in a cheap navy blazer approached me. "Ms. Holloway, I'm Dylan from Building Security. I'll walk you up." We stepped into the elevator together. Neither of us spoke a word. I could see his reflection in the brushed steel wall panels. He looked awkward, polite, maybe even a little apologetic. I didn't break the silence to make him feel better. The third floor looked much smaller than I remembered, or maybe I had just finally stopped seeing it as my home. Most of the old cubicles had been entirely rearranged to fit the new aesthetic. A sleek, useless touchscreen display now hung exactly where my old project roadmap whiteboard used to be. My old corner office already had a different nameplate taped to the door. The blinds were pulled half closed. My personal things had been carelessly packed into a medium-sized cardboard box and left sitting on a side desk in the hallway like a total afterthought. No one from my old team was waiting for me. No one came out to say hello or goodbye. I walked over to the box slowly. Dylan stayed planted at the door, giving me space. Inside the box were the usual sad remnants of a corporate life. My favorite ceramic mug with the blue skyline print, a couple of heavy notebooks, an old faded photo of my dad and me at my college graduation, and a corporate flash drive keychain I hadn't seen in years. I took my time checking my old desk drawers, even though I knew they were supposed to be empty. The top ones held nothing but dust and a single bent paper clip. But the bottom drawer, which always used to stick, caught my attention. It was slightly jammed. I tugged it open hard with both hands. Something had slid behind the back drawer panel. I reached in and pulled it out. It was a thick yellow folder, warped at the edges, heavy with papers. I opened it right there. Inside were diagrams, my diagrams. The absolute original Sentinel architecture, hand-sketched meticulously on engineering vellum. Page after page of core structure, node mapping, redundancy layers, biometric logic trees, and access hierarchy grids. In the bottom right corner of the very first page, faint but unmistakable, was my signature. M. Holloway. April 17, 2016. Brooklyn, NY. I stared at it, and a small part of me genuinely wanted to laugh out loud. They had tried so hard to erase me from the company, tried to replace me with cheap suits, overwrite my legacy, and completely ignore the foundations I had built. But right here it was, the exact system they desperately depended on, drawn in black ink, born straight from my mind, signed and formally dated years before the phrase "new tech visionaries" was even a terrible marketing concept. This wasn't just nostalgia. This was hard, undeniable legal evidence. I tucked the heavy folder carefully at the very bottom of the cardboard box, safely beneath the coffee mug and the framed photo. Dylan shifted his weight at the door, clearly uncomfortable, but still said nothing. I nodded to him when I was finally ready. We walked back through the main hall, right past a dozen people who once called me their tech oracle and who now suddenly found their shoes incredibly interesting to look at. I couldn't even blame them. This place had a toxic way of encouraging silence for survival. The elevator ride down was painfully quiet. As we hit the lobby, Dylan finally spoke up. "Take care, Ms. Holloway." I nodded back at him. "You too, Dylan." As I stepped through the revolving doors and outside, a massive gust of cold wind hit my face for the first time in weeks. I didn't feel numb anymore. I felt hyper-aware of the heavy weight in the box I carried and the sheer power it represented. They honestly thought they were escorting me out like some leftover trash, but I was walking away holding the one thing they could never, ever recreate. And now, I had the undeniable proof. I didn't look back as the heavy glass doors closed behind me. Carrian Technologies was now just a fading shape in my rearview mirror, but I didn't need to turn around, because what was coming for them was already in motion. As I walked across the massive parking lot carrying the last remnants of 18 years of my life in a cardboard box, my phone buzzed softly in my heavy coat pocket. I paused beside my car door, shielding the screen from the biting wind. Sentinel log notification. Status: inactive admin protocol detected. Countdown initiated. 3 hours remaining. There were no screaming sirens, no flashing red lights, just a quiet digital signal. I didn't trigger it manually. I didn't have to. Sentinel was always watching, always checking, and it inherently knew the difference between a routine exit and a hostile exile. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky was turning a bruised lavender. My apartment was dead quiet. The air carried that sharp, early winter crispness that made the walls seem to echo a little more than usual. I placed the box carefully on the dining table, slid my laptop out from the drawer, and powered it up. A familiar, comforting hum greeted me as I logged directly into my private Sentinel console, the master version buried deep behind layers of heavy obfuscation, accessible only through a specific physical device I had registered securely 5 years ago. No backdoors, no cheap internet loopholes, just one clean, impenetrable connection. The master dashboard appeared on screen. Phase 1 scheduled. Access layer disruption. 2 hours, 47 minutes, and 36 seconds remaining. Everything looked totally normal on their end. System operations showed as stable. No red alerts for the IT desk, but the malicious code was already slowly unfurling in the background like a dark flower. I leaned back in my desk chair, sipping some lukewarm coffee from the mug I'd just brought home, the one with the Carrian logo slightly chipped on the handle. I didn't feel triumphant or giddy. I just felt incredibly still. Sentinel wasn't built to maliciously crash the company and burn it to the ground. It was built to prove exactly one thing, that they never actually controlled it. From the top menu bar, I selected the hidden drop-down option labeled Override Protocols and manually entered a multi-phase command string. Initiate Layered Freeze Protocol. Confirm. Y. N. I hit Y. This wasn't a sudden shutdown. It was a quiet, methodical suffocation. Sentinel would start by misaligning basic user permissions, just slightly enough that employee credentials wouldn't work the first time they tried to log in. Then, it would begin staggering failures in the system-side scheduling, pausing critical back-end processes for milliseconds longer than expected. Outbound emails would queue in the server, but stubbornly refuse to deliver. Sales dashboards would load, but with incomplete datasets. Heavy financial tools would permanently freeze right at the confirmation screen. All of it perfectly timed to hit in completely random intervals across different departments. Untraceable, seemingly unconnected, totally chaotic, but not immediately catastrophic to the teams inside Carrian. It would just feel like a run of bad luck, like a coincidence, like the system was simply tired and acting up. I flipped over to the live monitoring feed. Already, Sentinel was recording minor, beautiful disruptions. 8:42 p.m. Payroll API delay. Retry queued. 8:56 p.m. Login loop access timeout. Regional manager, U.S. West. 9:01 p.m. Financial record desync. Checksum mismatch error. Nothing huge, nothing loud enough to trigger the fire alarms. And that was exactly the point. I wasn't here to burn it all down to the studs. Not yet. I was just here to make them extremely uncomfortable in their own stolen kingdom. Across the dimly lit room, the box I had carried out of the office sat half open. The yellow folder inside seemed to glow under the warm lamplight. I didn't need to read the pages again. I had memorized every single line of that Sentinel blueprint years ago, but its physical presence there was grounding. It was real. They had walked me out like I was totally irrelevant, but I was still living deep in their walls, still breathing in their wires. I typed out one final command for the night. If admin root reset requested, activate system decoy. If anyone over there managed to try and fix it, Sentinel would smoothly show them a shadow version. A perfectly clean, harmless-looking replica environment that gave the total illusion of stability. Meanwhile, the real system would just continue freezing up, cutting off one invisible vein at a time. I shut the laptop gently and stood by the window, watching the yellow streetlights flicker on across the neighborhood. The city was quiet, and so was I. But tomorrow morning, they would begin to feel what they could no longer see, and I'd be watching their every single step. The very first ripple hit just after 9:00 a.m. From my apartment window, I drank my coffee and watched the morning traffic crawl by like absolutely nothing was wrong in the world. But inside Carrian HQ, the air would have already shifted. Not full-blown, screaming panic just yet, but the specific kind of irritated, sweaty confusion that made people whisper a little harder, tap their keyboards a little faster, and hit refresh on their browsers a little more aggressively. It started with payroll. The HR team simply couldn't access the time-tracking module. Logins were fully accepted, then instantly redirected in endless loops. Timesheet submissions hung indefinitely on frozen loading screens. Someone would have called the IT help desk. It would have sighed and said, "Just try again in 10 minutes, guys." Then came the severe email delays. Crucial internal threads broke apart mid-chain. Important replies simply vanished into the ether. Calendar invites showed up as sent on the host's end but never arrived in anyone's inbox. Some project teams got so frustrated they switched entirely to group texts. Others actually began calling physical desk phones like it was 2006. By 10:30 a.m., the main CRM platform flat out refused to sync. Real-time updates for the quarterly sales projections failed to upload to the cloud. Massive client orders showed as pending when they'd already shipped out from the warehouse days ago. A furious sales director up in the Boston office threatened to call a major client manually, only to discover his digital contact list wouldn't even load. And through it all, I watched from my screen, calm, quiet, and hyper-focused. Sentinel was doing exactly what I'd taught it to do. It wasn't crashing the company, it was just bending it, layer by layer, until it creaked loud enough for everyone in the C-suite to hear. By noon, someone finally escalated the issue. A company-wide emergency meeting was called. I couldn't see the video feed, of course, but I could vividly imagine the room. Philip standing at the front, expensive sleeves rolled up, looking performative and deeply annoyed. Savannah standing right beside him, her jaw stiff, desperately flipping through half-formed bullshit explanations about the system transition roadmap, hitting a minor speed bump. It must have been a brutal meeting, because by 1:15 p.m., Savannah's admin name started showing up in multiple raw log entries. She was frantically trying to ping the legacy environments, running deep diagnostics with incomplete admin keys, and even desperately requesting access to archive directories that had been dead for over 3 years. Meanwhile, Sentinel's freeze protocol was still only in Phase 2. Just enough to totally confuse them, not quite enough for them to connect the dots to me. But then came the twist I honestly didn't expect. At 3:04 p.m., a junior systems engineer named Felix Tran logged into a deep diagnostic shell and accidentally triggered something most senior devs wouldn't even notice. He'd run a massive deep trace scan on the CRM pipeline and stumbled upon a non-indexed relay command buried deep inside the transaction buffer. That command had a specific file name, sentinelproxy.root.log. It definitely wasn't supposed to show up on his scan, but the kid had been incredibly thorough. He tried to open the log file. Sentinel instantly rejected the attempt. He ran the script through again, this time smartly using a limited access override command. Sentinel didn't block him outright this time. Instead, it offered him a pop-up message. Secure biometric credential required. Voice signature mismatch. Felix, probably just thinking it was a buggy leftover test module, tried checking the file properties to see who created the original signature. And right there it was. Credential owner, M. Holloway at Archived. I paused my breathing when I saw the log alert violently appear on my own dashboard. My hands were perfectly steady, but I didn't move them. I just stared at the screen as the terminal blinked rapidly, waiting for his input. They'd finally tripped over the dinosaur bones of the system they never understood. Felix didn't have anywhere near the clearance to go further. The system violently kicked him out, flagged his IP attempt, and dumped him back to the main console with zero further access. I imagined him frowning deeply at his screen, unsure if he'd just made a massive breakthrough or touched a highly forbidden wire. I imagined him glancing nervously across the room toward Savannah, internally debating whether to mention the name he just saw. And then I imagined Savannah hearing that name, my name, and feeling her throat tighten. From my living room couch, I watched Sentinel instantly restabilize itself, automatically scrubbing the entire access path Felix had just uncovered. The log remained perfectly intact, but it was now nested one layer deeper, far away from anyone curious enough to try that trick again. I didn't smile. Not quite yet. But I felt something warm bloom in my chest. It wasn't revenge, and it wasn't pride. It was something quieter. Something earned. They were finally beginning to feel it. The brutal slowness, the massive cracks in the walls, the glaring gaps in their total control, and no matter how many expensive firewalls they threw at the problem, they would never, ever reach the core. Because the core was me, and I never gave them the keys. I closed the laptop gently as the wall clock struck 4. Outside, the winter wind picked up. Another domino had fallen, and their table was starting to violently shake. By the next morning, the cracks had become totally undeniable. Carrian's systems weren't just acting sluggish anymore, they were fundamentally failing. The shiny facade of control Philip had tried so hard to maintain was rapidly unraveling, and even from miles away, I could feel the blind panic rippling through the glass building like static electricity. They'd spent the entire previous day desperately chasing ghosts, restarting workstations, screaming at vendors on the phone, blaming outdated hardware from the previous regime. But today, they finally realized the ghost wasn't going away. I knew Philip well enough to accurately predict his next move. At 8:20 a.m., I received a hard confirmation through Sentinel's observer logs. A new set of heavily encrypted IPs had been granted temporary super admin access. He had officially called in outside help, heavy-hitting cybersecurity contractors from a massive firm down in D.C., according to the metadata securely embedded in their device IDs. The goal was crystal clear: wipe absolutely everything. Factory reset the entire infrastructure, remove the lingering chaos, and start totally fresh. But Sentinel wasn't built to be rebooted like a broken MacBook. It had safeguards, and more importantly, it had me. I watched live from my console as the expensive external team began their probe. They started with standard superficial scans, checking for common malware and mapping the massive traffic bottlenecks. Then they moved much deeper, running aggressive diagnostics that brushed right up against Sentinel's outer defense threads. It took them exactly 20 minutes to realize the math didn't add up. By 9:05 a.m., one of the lead engineers, Jared Maddox, judging by his registered login ID, identified a hidden thread buried beneath Carrian's real-time analytics engine. He flagged it for immediate escalation, and I could almost picture the war room. A dozen people huddled around one glowing monitor, eyes narrowing in confusion. Then came the bypass attempt. Jared wrote a clever custom script specifically designed to smoothly penetrate nested virtual partitions. On his 4th try, he accidentally triggered Sentinel's containment response. It wasn't the full, aggressive lockout, just a soft firewall reroute, a gentle warning, the digital kind that says, "Hey buddy, you're getting way too close." But Jared didn't stop. On attempt 5, his script ran a massive brute force simulation, hammering blindly through the false paths until it very nearly found Sentinel's access seed, a unique digital fingerprint that leads directly to the core logic engine. For a fraction of a moment, I felt a sharp, totally unexpected pinch of anxiety hit my chest. He was clever, a little too clever. I held my breath as his script rapidly compiled. Then, Sentinel made its move. Access anomaly detected. Unrecognized admin authority. Revoking all permissions. In less than 1 standard second, Jared's entire set of credentials was permanently deleted from the internal system tree. Every clearance, every alias, every single access path tying him to Carrian's network was vaporized. It was exactly as if he'd never even touched the building's Wi-Fi. His screen would have gone completely black, then forcefully rebooted without his profile. I exhaled slowly, sinking into my chair. It wasn't joy I felt right then. Strangely, it was a slight disappointment, because for a split second, I'd actually hoped another engineer might be able to see it, to truly understand the sheer beauty of what I built, not to steal it, but to grasp its incredible depth. But Jared, exactly like the others, had been paid to come in and dismantle, not to learn. Still, there was something oddly comforting about how Sentinel responded to the threat. Clean, immediate, ruthlessly protective. It remembered its core purpose, even when everyone else in the world forgot who actually gave it one. Back inside Carrian HQ, the logs showed rising tension. A completely new alert chain began pinging frantically across the systems, desperate team leaders questioning why their highly paid emergency consultant had suddenly lost all access mid-investigation. Philip issued an immediate temporary lockdown of all admin terminals. Savannah attempted to manually reassign the probe to her internal staff, but it was way too late. The entire narrative was shifting. What had started as a minor system hiccup was now rapidly becoming something much bigger, something incredibly deliberate, something highly dangerous. I stood up from my chair, stepped over to the living room window, and let the early morning sun hit my face. It had rained hard that morning, and the dark pavement shimmered with bright traces of gold. For the first time in weeks, I let myself fully feel it. Hope. Not because they were failing miserably, but because the cold, hard truth was finally starting to rise to the surface. No more hiding in the shadows, no more pretending I was just a drone. I had never wanted to hurt Carrian. I'd only ever wanted to be seen and respected. And now, one failed reset attempt at a time, they were finally being forced to look. I knew it was only a matter of time before Philip stopped blindly chasing tech phantoms and started pointing fingers at real people. What I didn't expect was exactly how quickly he'd turn to blame, and exactly how brazenly he'd do it. It started with a formal letter late Thursday afternoon. My personal email pinged loudly. The subject line was sterile and terrifying. Notice of legal inquiry, Carrian Technologies. For a brief, panicked moment, I thought it might be a routing mistake. Then I opened the attached PDF. Inside was a massive formal accusation, drafted by Carrian's aggressive legal team and officially copied to a ruthless outside law firm. In it, they directly alleged that I had intentionally compromised the company's infrastructure, maliciously introduced rogue code, and blatantly violated my strict confidentiality agreement post-termination. There were dense paragraphs of complex legalese dressed up in incredibly vague claims. Unusual system behaviors traced back to legacy-level processes strictly maintained by a former employee. Potential acts of corporate sabotage carried out via unauthorized remote access. Unauthorized retention of proprietary company frameworks. They smartly never used my actual name outright in the accusations, but I wasn't stupid. It was entirely about me. My hands went ice cold as I scrolled quickly through the pages. There were heavily veiled threats about massive financial litigation, strict demands for a written response within 24 hours, and a hard request to cease any and all contact with Carrian networks. I sat perfectly still at my desk, letting the anger slowly rise. Not hot, explosive rage, but a slow, highly pressurized fury. They had fired me like a dog in front of a room full of my peers. They had tried to erase my legacy, and now, to cover their own massive incompetence, they were actively trying to destroy my life. And yet, right underneath the fury, there was a profound, calm awareness, because I had something they absolutely didn't. I stood up, walked over to the bookshelf beside my desk, and pulled out the sad cardboard box I had carried home from the office 5 days earlier. Safely beneath my coffee mug and the framed photo of my dad was the heavy yellow folder. I opened it carefully, treating it like a holy relic. There it was, the original Sentinel Master Blueprint, drawn in black ink, heavily annotated in blue pencil, my signature stamped at the bottom corner, M. Holloway, April 17, 2016, Brooklyn, NY. It wasn't just a pretty design sketch. It was a legally time-stamped artifact, a perfect record of authorship, the code language, the file structure, the conceptual layer mapping. All of it entirely predated Carrian's involvement by over a year. I hadn't built Sentinel for them on company dime. I had brought it with me, enhanced it privately under my own secure protocols, and essentially leased it to their systems through an architectural integration that never once touched company-owned server racks. I even had the original file creation metadata safely backed up on a drive, along with the hosting server invoices I paid myself, the registration details for the private relay server, and an airtight licensing agreement I had quietly drafted years ago but strategically never executed. It was all just sitting right there in my encrypted hard drive, ready and waiting for 6 years. I had been the systems architect, the lead operator, and the silent guardian. And now, for the first time in my life, I was about to become its legal defender. I immediately called my attorney. She'd helped me sort out some minor patent protections years ago, but she knew my work ethic well enough to understand the massive gravity of this moment. After I forwarded her the threatening email and the attached folder documentation, she called me back almost instantly. "Philip seriously doesn't know what he just walked into," she said flatly over the phone. "They've made a massive, catastrophic mistake. This isn't just a baseless, bad faith accusation, Marin. It's borderline corporate defamation, and you have the airtight proof to bury them." I let out a slow, shaky breath I hadn't even realized I'd been holding. The heavy pressure in my chest finally loosened, not because the fight was over, but because I now held the giant sledgehammer needed to finish it. The very next morning, my attorney officially submitted our response to Carrian's legal team. It was short, impeccably professional, and heavily laced with a stone-cold calm they absolutely wouldn't see coming. Securely attached to it was the scanned original blueprint, fully dated, signed, and legally irrefutable. And just like that, the total silence on their end became significantly louder than anything they'd ever said to me in person. They had aggressively tried to turn me into the villain of their story, but they forgot one crucial thing. You don't accuse the architect of burning down the building when she's the one who laid every single brick. The massive cracks had finally reached the top floor. After a brutal week of operational chaos, disrupted payroll runs, corrupted client data, wildly failed platform recovery attempts, and a nasty legal threat that totally backfired on them, Carrian's executive board had absolutely no choice left. A highly private, high-level investor meeting was scheduled for early Friday morning. It was supposedly meant to be a simple formality, a fake show of control to calm the nerves. Instead, it became a spectacular unraveling. At 9:00 a.m. sharp, the conference room lights dimmed, and a dozen incredibly wealthy faces flickered onto the massive screen. Some dialing in from Manhattan, others from Zurich, and one guy from Tokyo looking wide-eyed despite the late hour there. Most were strict shareholders who never once paid attention to the boring details of system architecture. They cared exclusively about hard deliverables, quarterly gains, and market confidence. But that morning, all they cared about was one single word: Sentinel. I wasn't actually there in the room, not in person anyway, but I didn't need to be. Sentinel's live monitoring interface was wide open on my apartment monitors, quietly recording every single login, every frantic click, every document shared on their network. The system had been silently invited directly into the video meeting via a shared audit file that Savannah had foolishly uploaded to the cloud for transparency. She literally didn't realize Sentinel could see everything running inside it. Philip stood stiffly at the head of the long boardroom table, looking visibly tense. His tone was tightly controlled, his corporate language heavily rehearsed. He desperately tried to blame the recent catastrophic outages on a residual infrastructure flaw inherited from a previous era. A few heads on the monitors nodded slowly. One woman jotted something down in a leather notebook. Then came the single question that utterly shattered his script. A voice from the upper right corner of the video screen, deep, calm, and unmistakably American, cut right in. "Who owns Sentinel?" Philip blinked hard, losing his rhythm. "Pardon the system? Is it proprietary to Carrian, or is it subcontracted out? Because its massive footprint doesn't match the internal infrastructure outlined in our last technology brief." Philip shifted his weight nervously. It was built internally years ago. It's legacy architecture, strictly maintained under our internal systems division. A heavy, suffocating beat of silence followed. Then the voice returned, sharper this time. "That's not what I was told." Everyone in the room naturally turned their heads to the screen. The speaker's name appeared in bold text at the bottom of his feed. Elliot Crane, Senior Equity Partner at Havenbrook Capital. He wasn't just an investor, he was the investor. The man whose massive early funding round had kept Carrian afloat during its first scaling crisis. His words carried immense weight, and his face, though perfectly calm, was totally unreadable. "I actually met with Marin Holloway 3 years ago," Elliot continued, leaning into his camera. "At the Q3 partner lunch in Boston. We sat directly across from each other. She walked me through an incredibly complex schematic she drew on a cocktail napkin, the exact same logic structure this Sentinel system currently appears to follow." He leaned forward even closer to the lens. "I remember it clearly because I actually saved that napkin. She said, and I quote, 'It's the nervous system behind the noise. No one sees it, but it keeps everything alive.'" He glanced off screen for a second, then added with a devastatingly casual tone, "And I still have that napkin, complete with her signature." Philip's face instantly lost all its color. Savannah went dead still, her hands frozen helplessly above her laptop keyboard. A few investors on the screen exchanged alarmed glances. The physical room seemed to exhale all its oxygen, then violently hold its breath. Someone from the Zurich feed finally unmuted and asked, "So, the system isn't ours?" Elliot nodded slightly, his expression grim. "I'm beginning to seriously wonder if it ever was." I watched from the safety of my apartment as Sentinel perfectly captured every single agonizing second of it. I didn't smile, not fully, but my tight jaw finally relaxed and my hands completely unclenched. It was the very first time someone with real power had spoken my name out loud and directly attached it to the massive thing I built, instead of the tiny role they tried to erase. Philip fumbled pathetically for a response, mumbling some absolute nonsense about incomplete system documentation and pending legal clarifications. But the damage was permanently done. You simply can't lie to the man holding the giant checkbook. The big meeting abruptly ended 20 minutes early. No solid decisions were made, no warm reassurances were offered, just incredibly big, incredibly expensive questions left hanging in the air. As the video feed finally shut down, I sat back in the quiet stillness of my living room, the bright morning sunlight pouring in through the blinds. This time, the silence didn't feel like a harsh exile. It felt exactly like gravity shifting back into perfect balance. They had aggressively tried to bury me in the dirt, but their entire foundation had been built on what I wrote. On my logic, my code, my vision. And now, finally, someone had grabbed the spotlight and turned it in the right direction. It wasn't blind revenge I felt right then, it was pure recognition, and it was long, long overdue. The job offer came in exactly 2 days after that disastrous investor meeting. It wasn't from some giant tech firm, no massive billion-dollar unicorn, no flashy household name. Just a quiet, steadily growing tech startup right here in Boston, one I'd personally helped advise years ago when they were still grinding away out of a shared loft on folding tables. The founder, Ava Lynn, had been a bright junior systems engineer back then, barely 30 years old, but significantly sharper than most VPs I'd ever met at Carrian. Now, she was the CEO, and she wanted me to join the team as her chief technology officer. No corporate politics, no ego games, just a simple, direct email. "We're building something that actually deserves to scale. We want you to build its brain. Are you in?" I didn't even hesitate. The new company didn't have Carrian's massive resources, but it had something vastly better: integrity, genuine curiosity, and the profound humility to actually know what it didn't know. It was exactly the kind of place where Sentinel had always belonged in the first place. So I quietly took the offer. No big LinkedIn announcement, no corporate fanfare. And then I simply renamed the core architecture Sentinel-1 with a brand new internal tagline: "Built on trust, reborn in silence." This time around, the system wouldn't have to live hiding in the shadows. It would proudly anchor everything by design, not by accident. We completely rebuilt its core, seamlessly integrating the strongest bulletproof parts of the original engine while completely stripping away the clunky legacy constraints that once heavily tied it to Carrian's decaying framework. My new executive team didn't ask, "How do we aggressively market this?" They asked, "How do we protect people with it?" And for the very first time in a long time, I finally felt like I wasn't guarding the gates totally alone. Meanwhile, Carrian spectacularly spiraled. The investor board immediately began freezing all major budget approvals. Client trust totally plummeted. Damning articles started surfacing quietly in niche tech journals. Brutal phrases like critical architecture mismanagement and loss of internal system provenance crept right into the headlines. Their stock dipped heavily, and then it dipped again. Savannah was quietly and quickly removed from all public-facing roles. Philip totally stopped appearing on internal company comms. A new interim CTO was hastily named. Some clueless guy pulled from the finance department. It was really only a matter of time before the doors closed. I didn't gloat. I didn't try to retaliate, but I didn't turn my head away either. Exactly 1 week after our massive system relaunch, I visited a sleek co-working building downtown. Sentinel-1 had just officially onboarded its 5th massive beta client. I stepped out onto the breezy rooftop to take a quick phone call. And when it ended, I just stayed out there for a while, staring out across the vast city skyline. From that height, I could clearly see Carrian's headquarters in the distance. All glass, chrome, and pristine architecture. But I could also see the deep cracks, the flickering, dying lights on the 12th floor, the half-empty employee parking lot at mid-morning, the massive empire I had helped build from scratch, now rapidly slipping through the massive cracks of its own staggering arrogance. And I smiled. Not wide, not wicked, just enough. Because I knew a secret they never bothered to learn. You can fire a job title, but you can never erase the mind that built the damn foundation. Sometimes real power doesn't ever need to shout. Sometimes it just needs to quietly outlast all the noise. If you've ever been overlooked, violently silenced, or unfairly replaced, only to rise back up with something 10 times stronger, this story is specifically for you. Share your own thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been severely underestimated, only to completely turn the tables on them later? If this story hit home for you, leave a like, share it with someone who desperately needs to hear it today, and don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of quiet revenge and heavily earned redemption. Because some corporate systems may inevitably go down, but the right ones always restart.